Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking a little bit more into UI. We're going to be looking into the multimodal UI, which is basically a UI with several screens or several modals. But instead of me explaining it, let's just jump right into it and see how it looks when it's done, and then we'll break it down and see how it's built. Cool. So you can see here, we're back in the same spot, still SteamVR. So this means that we still don't have hands. But I have changed something here. So now I cannot reload the scene with a single button press because I replaced that input. Now instead pulls up this menu. You can see here we have a bunch of buttons, but we'll click first on reload so we get the hands back. So that reloads the scene, and now you can see my hands here. So yeah, with this button press I can pull up this nice simple UI with a bunch of buttons, and same button press hides it away. But then if I click here on the inventory that we built before, now that gets pulled up as well. And this follows the same construction as before. So if I look around, it follows the camera. So it's always looking at me, and then the UI itself works just fine. And when I close it, the original UI is back. So now let's see how it's built. You can see here that we have an in-game UI object here. And we'll just jump right into it and open it up as a prefab. This one has a couple of UI elements here. It has the in-game UI that you saw before, and it has the inventory UI. And the way that this works is that it has an in-game UI script here that's controlling the UI in general. And then we are using here in the menu buttons that are set up here, we have a call for each one of them. We can actually look at them a little bit closer. So we have the menu buttons canvas here. There's a vertical layout. It just sets up the buttons here in a nice vertical layout without me having to place them individually, much like we set up the inventory slots here in the inventory UI. If you remember, the inventory panel has a similar thing, but it has a grid layout. But yeah, that's how that's set up. And then it has a bunch of buttons inside, each one for a different purpose. We have the inventory button that you saw before. Then we have the build button that we're going to hook up later to actually start building things. That's going to be the next UI that we build. Then I'm getting way ahead of myself, but there's a craft button here that eventually I want to add some crafting functionality, so that will live there. There needs to be a questing system. That's just part of how the game is meant to work. Again, that will be later. And then two system buttons. One is the reload one and the quit one. So yeah, this is just the way that the UI is set up. For actions that happen inside of the model here, I already put it in the prefab here, so you can see for the inventory button, on click, it turns on the inventory UI. It sets the previous UI for the inventory UI to be the in-game UI. And we'll see why that's important later. And then it turns off the in-game UI. So that's how that's set up. Then if we jump outside of the prefab, you can see that there are a few other things here. For example, the reload button here has a reload scene event on click, and the quit button has a quit event on click. We'll look in a minute as well. But those aren't set up in the prefab because they depend on the player component. That's the game state, which is this one. If we later move the game state component outside of the player, or we change that, we may be able to get into the UI itself, but for now it's not there. So let's just quickly look into the code so we see what's going on here. So yeah, starting with the main UI, the in-game UI component here. This is pretty simple. We need a couple of things. We need to know which one of the UI canvases is going to be the main UI. And then we need a private array here where we're keeping track of all the children canvases. Then on start, we populate that. We get the multimodal UI canvas children. We'll see what that is in a second. And then for each one of those children, we set them to false. And then when we toggle the main UI, we have this separate main UI canvas that we're tracking here, and we set that to active or inactive. And we set that to active or inactive depending on what it is. So if it's currently active, then we turn it inactive or active false. And then if it's currently active false or inactive, then we set it to true. So that's how that's set up. Pretty simple. But then we can see here in this class here the multimodal UI canvas, which is a mono behavior that gets attached to any UI that we need to be part of this multimodal behavior. And the main thing that this is doing is just keeping track of the previous UI, so we can always go back. For now, that's the only functionality that we need to add. We need to be able to say, hey, whenever we jump out of this, we need to go back to the previous UI. And this helps in having more deeply nested UI without having to set a bunch of back buttons or anything like that. It's a dynamic chain, so it also allows you to be able to move through different UIs in different flows. So if there's, let's say, several ways to get to the map, if there's a map UI, then you don't need to know exactly all the ways that you can get to that UI and code that into specific buttons so you can go back in time properly. We just set this as runtime, and then whichever UI helped us get to this current UI, then we set as a previous UI for this. And then we have a method there for setting that up that we were calling there on the button click, if you remember. And then whenever we disable that UI, which is our way of closing it, we just enable the previous UI, which is the behavior that you were seeing before, where whenever we close the inventory, the main menu pops back up. That's what's handled here. There's a couple more things that changed. As you saw before, I added a quit behavior here. This is pretty much boilerplate code. You can copy it right off. It just does some nice things that it checks whether we're in the Unity editor, and if we are, we get out of play mode. This one we're not going to use, but it's boilerplate to have. If we're using it in a web player, then there's a specific application quit URL that we want to open. And then if we are in an actual application, we do application.quit. And that's what will actually happen on device whenever it's running inside the headset. Then we're going to call application.quit, and that triggers outside to the menu. In the case of the Oculus Quest, it sends you back to the Oculus menu. And then one final thing that we didn't quite get to see, but it's something I wanted to add from before, is the way that currently the UI is set up to follow the player. It has some limitations where, because the UI doesn't move as fast, it can get way behind the player. And depending on where it was before, when it's disabled, it doesn't get updated anymore. So if you disable it in the middle of the map and then move to one edge of the map, it will take a long time to get there. Because this is a linear interpolation, or lerping, it's not that much, but it does make it feel a little bit slow. So I set up a couple of things here. One, I pulled out the follow speed times delta time calculation we were doing inside of these interpolations outside. And then I'm checking here, if we are too far, then we increase the step distance significantly so we can quickly move closer or warp closer. And both of these here are new float references that we'll see in a bit, but currently they're set up if it's more than 1 unit of distance, then warp, and the warp percentage here is 90% or 0.9 for a float, which means that it will get most of the way there but still have that extra 10% to actually interpolate in other frames, so that it doesn't just pop into the view, but it actually pops in and moves slightly into position. It looks a little bit nice. So that's how that's set up. It's pretty straightforward. It's a pretty short video here, but that's the main thing that we're building here. So yeah, that's it for the multimodal. Let's just trigger that up once more so you can see how that's working. So here we are again. You can see I can trigger the UI, and you can see it comes up really quick, and that's the warping. If you turn around fast, you can see it popping up. You can hopefully see that moving there. But if you're moving slow, it's just following you around. And similarly, if let's say I turn around a bit, you'll see there, when I clicked for the inventory, it will just immediately come up there. It just warps into the position there. And if you move quickly, it just warps. If you move slowly, it moves slowly with you. And when you close it, the other menu comes back up. So that's how that's set up. I hope that was useful for you to see this multimodal UI. It's very powerful. It can get deeply nested, and it's just very useful to be able to have different UIs separately, but be able to trigger and jump between them freely without having to set up a big structure beforehand. But yeah, that's all for today. I hope it was useful. Yeah, let me know in the comments what you would like to see next. For now, I'll sign off. Thank you, and see you in the next one.